Did you know that some of the most common plants in your garden could be silently waging war against your tomato plants, and most gardeners never discover the true culprit until the entire season is already lost? Imagine this: you've staked your tomatoes faithfully. You've watered on schedule. You fed them with compost and care and the very best intentions, and yet your plants yellow too early. The fruit is smaller than it should be. The blight arrives like a shadow no one can explain. And you assume it was the weather, or the soil, or just a bad season. But here's the real kicker. In many cases, it isn't any of those things. It's something you planted right beside them. Something that looks beautiful, grows well, and fits perfectly into your garden plan, yet works against your tomatoes at the chemical, structural, and biological level simultaneously. Today, we're going to change that. I'll walk you through the 7 plants that silently sabotage tomato growth, organized by exactly how they cause harm, so you can rearrange your garden beds with clarity and confidence. And stay with me to the very end, because plant number 7 is the companion planting mistake that destroys more tomato harvests than anything else, and most gardeners never realize it's happening until both crops are already gone. Before we dive into our list, I want to give you a framework that will change the way you think about companion planting forever, not just for tomatoes, but for every plant in your garden. Plants harm their neighbors in 3 distinct ways. The first is what botanists call allelopathy, or what I like to call soil poisoning. These are plants that release chemical compounds through their roots that suppress the growth of nearby plants. Some do it while they're alive, others do it after they've decomposed into the soil. Either way, the damage is invisible and cumulative. The second category is resource rivalry. These are plants that simply want the same things your tomatoes want: nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and sunlight, and they want more of it than your tomatoes can compete for. And the third, perhaps the most dangerous, is what I call the disease bridge. These are plants that share identical pathogens, pests, and fungal vulnerabilities with tomatoes. Plant them nearby, and you've built a highway for disease to travel directly from one plant to the next. Keep these 3 categories in mind as we go through our list. By the end, you'll see your entire garden differently. Let's dive in. First, and this is one that surprises even experienced gardeners every time, black walnut. Now, black walnut is magnificent, ancient, deeply rooted in North American landscapes, its timber among the most prized in the world. It feels like a generous, grounding presence in any garden. But here is what black walnut is doing beneath the surface that you cannot see. The black walnut tree produces a compound called juglone, released through its roots, its leaves, its hulls, and even through rainwater washing over its bark into the surrounding soil. Juglone is one of the most potent allelopathic substances in all of the plant kingdom, and tomatoes are among the most sensitive plants on Earth to its presence. Here's what juglone does. It interferes directly with the enzymatic processes plants use for cellular respiration. In effect, it suffocates the plant at the root level. Tomato plants near black walnuts exhibit what's known as walnut wilt, rapid wilting, yellowing, and collapse, even when they appear to have adequate water and nutrients. The damage looks exactly like blight. It is misdiagnosed as disease constantly. The true cause is invisible, underground, and irreversible once it is set in. And here is the detail that changes everything. Juglone doesn't disappear when the tree is removed. It can persist in soil for several years after a black walnut is cut down, meaning gardens established where walnut trees once stood can still be toxic to tomatoes long after the tree itself is gone. In many indigenous plant traditions, the black walnut tree is understood as a sovereign presence, a plant that holds its own territory with fierce and unyielding clarity. What spiritual ecology observed intuitively, plant science has now confirmed chemically. Not all powerful presences are meant to share their space. The rule: never plant tomatoes within 60 feet of a black walnut tree. Do not use black walnut leaves as mulch. Do not compost walnut hulls or debris into beds that will host tomatoes. If you suspect historical walnut presence in your soil, test before planting any Solanaceae family crops. Some roots run deeper than we can see, and claim more territory than we realize. Next, we have fennel. And if you watched our companion planting video for peppers earlier this season, you'll recognize this one immediately because fennel doesn't discriminate. It harms tomatoes for the exact same reason it harms peppers, and the mechanism is just as invisible and just as persistent. FENNEL releases two primary allelopathic compounds through its root system, anethole and fenchone. These chemicals leach directly into surrounding soil and suppress root development in neighboring plants. For tomatoes specifically, they inhibit the fine root hairs responsible for water and mineral absorption, meaning your tomatoes can be growing in perfectly amended moisture-rich soil and still struggle to uptake what they need because the FENNEL beside them has quietly compromised the system. The trap most gardeners fall into is this: they plant FENNEL alongside a kitchen garden and assume its tall, fragrant, pollinator-attracting presence is purely generous. It looks like it belongs. It behaves beautifully above ground. But what it's doing underground tells a different story. And here is the detail that catches even experienced growers off guard. FENNEL's allelopathic residue persists in soil for an entire growing season after the plant has been removed. If you grew FENNEL in a bed last year and you're planting tomatoes there this spring, the chemical legacy may already be working against you before a single seedling goes in the ground. In traditional feng shui practice, FENNEL carries an expansive colonizing energy, a plant that extends its influence invisibly beyond its visible boundaries. What ancient plant wisdom observed symbolically, modern botany has confirmed chemically. The rule: keep FENNEL in a dedicated container or its own isolated bed, at least 10 feet from any tomato planting, with no shared soil drainage. Beauty and generosity are not the same thing. Know the difference before you plant. Now we move into our second category, resource rivals, and leading this group is the Brassica family: broccoli, kale, cabbage, cauliflower, and their cousins. Here's the science. Brassicas release glucosinolate compounds through their root systems as a natural pest deterrent, and these compounds are extraordinarily effective. They're part of what makes brassicas so resilient against insects and disease. But those same compounds alter soil chemistry in ways that work directly against tomatoes. Specifically, glucosinolates shift the soil's microbial ecosystem, reducing populations of the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi that tomato roots depend on to absorb phosphorus and trace minerals. And for tomatoes, phosphorus availability is everything. Lycopene, the compound responsible for a tomato's deep red color and the majority of its nutritional value, requires a precise phosphorus supply to develop fully in the fruit. When brassicas disrupt the fungal network that delivers it, your tomatoes may grow in fruit, but they will be paler, less flavorful, and nutritionally diminished in ways you can see and taste. Beyond the chemistry, brassicas are among the heaviest nitrogen feeders in the vegetable garden. They pull nitrogen at a rate that quietly outcompetes tomatoes in shared beds, leading to the kind of slow, invisible depletion that most gardeners attribute to a bad season rather than a companion planting mistake. The rule: maintain a minimum of 3 feet of separation between brassicas and tomatoes. If you must grow both in close proximity, apply a phosphorus-specific soil amendment exclusively to the tomato side of the bed to compensate. Abundance shared too thin nourishes nothing fully. Corn, the centerpiece of so many summer gardens, is a resource rival of a completely different kind. Its harm isn't primarily chemical, it's structural, and it happens faster than most gardeners expect. Once corn reaches full height, it creates a canopy that dramatically reduces the direct sunlight available to neighboring tomato plants. Tomatoes require 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight daily for optimal fruit development and lycopene production. A neighboring corn planting can cut that to 3 or 4 hours almost overnight during peak growing season, quietly stunning fruit set while you assume it's a heat or water issue. But there is a second problem that far fewer gardeners know about. The corn earworm and the tomato fruitworm are the same insect. Both are the larval form of Helicoverpa z, a moth that lays its eggs on corn silks but whose larvae are highly mobile and will migrate directly to tomato plants once corn is disturbed or harvested. Plant them in close proximity and you've created a pest relay. The moth completes its egg cycle in your corn and sends its larvae directly into your tomato crop. Now before we move on, I'd love to know which of these plants have you been growing near your tomatoes. Drop a comment below. I genuinely read every single one, and your answer might just save someone else's harvest. Here's the rule: never plant corn upwind or uphill from tomatoes. Maintain a minimum of 6 feet of separation, enough that the corn canopy cannot shade your tomato bed at its peak height. A garden that competes with itself cannot grow in peace. Plant number 5 is the one I promised would surprise you, even if you've been growing tomatoes for decades, and it requires an important distinction, because this one is not black and white. Dill, specifically, mature dill. Here's what most gardening advice tells you. Dill and tomatoes are friends. And in the early stages of dill's growth, that is genuinely true. Young, seedling stage dill attracts parasitic wasps that prey on tomato hornworms, repels aphids, and draws beneficial pollinators into your garden. In its early life, dill and tomatoes have a supportive, cooperative relationship that many experienced growers swear by. But here is what changes everything. Once dill bolts, once it begins to flower and go to seed, it shifts. Mature dill releases allelopathic compounds through its root system and through decaying foliage that suppress tomato root development and inhibit neighboring plant growth. The plant that was your tomato's early season ally becomes, by midsummer, a quiet saboteur, at exactly the time your tomatoes are entering peak fruiting and need maximum root function. The mistake most gardeners make, they plant dill early when it's beneficial. Forget about it through the busy midsummer weeks, and let it bolt and go to seed right alongside their tomatoes at the most critical moment of the fruiting cycle. In traditional herbal wisdom, dill is understood as a threshold herb, one that exists in 2 distinct states and asks gardeners to pay attention to which state it is currently in. It is neither ally nor adversary permanently. The rule: grow young dill near tomatoes freely in spring. But once your dill begins to flower and bolt, remove it from the bed completely. Do not compost flowering dill material into beds that will host tomatoes the same season. Wisdom asks us to know not just what something is, but what it is becoming. Now here is where I need to have an honest conversation with you, and I want you to stay with me, because this one requires some nuance. Peppers. If you've been following this companion planting series, you may have seen our video on plants to avoid near peppers. And, you may have noticed that in that video tomatoes appeared on the list. The relationship runs in both directions. Tomatoes and peppers are both members of the Solanaceae family, and they share an almost identical disease, vulnerability, profile. Bacterial spot, tobacco mosaic virus, early blight, and verticillium wilt can all move freely and rapidly between peppers and tomatoes. If your pepper plants contract any of these diseases, your tomatoes are the next guaranteed victim, and vice versa. They also share the same pest population simultaneously. Spider mites, aphids, and whiteflies treat a neighboring tomato pepper planting as a single, continuous feeding environment, moving between the 2 plants as though they share an address. Here's what makes this companion planting mistake so costly. One healthy season with both plants close together tells you nothing. The risk isn't constant, it's probabilistic. It's the season when one plant contracts disease that reveals the true danger. And by then, both crops are often beyond saving before you've identified the source. The rule: if you grow both tomatoes and peppers, maintain a minimum 4-foot physical separation. Rotate beds every single season. Never plant Solanaceae family crops in the same soil 2 consecutive years. And never compost either plant's debris into beds that will host the other crop the following season. True companions protect each other's vulnerabilities. When one weakens, both must be shielded. And now we've arrived at number 7, the one I promised you at the beginning, the companion planting mistake that surprises tomato gardeners more than any other: potatoes. I know what you're thinking. Potatoes and tomatoes feel so different. One grows underground, one climbs toward the sky. Their fruit looks nothing alike. What could they possibly share? Everything underground. Potatoes and tomatoes are both Solanaceae family members, and potatoes carry one of the most devastating plant pathogens in all of human history: Phytophthora infestans, the organism responsible for late blight, the same pathogen that triggered the Irish Potato Famine of the 1840s, killing over 1 million people and forcing millions more to emigrate. This is not a minor garden concern. This is among the most destructive plant pathogens ever documented, and it does not stay politely in the potato bed. Phytophthora infestans spreads through airborne spores, carried on moisture and wind. Tomato plants are equally susceptible. One infected potato plant upwind from your tomato bed can trigger a full late blight outbreak in your tomatoes within days. And late blight moves fast. It can destroy an entire tomato, planting in 1 to 2 weeks under warm, humid conditions. The lesions spread, the fruit collapses, the vines blacken, and it looks identical to several other common tomato diseases. Here is why this mistake is so persistent across gardens. Most growers never make the connection. They see blight on their tomatoes and assume it's a soil problem, a watering problem, a disease that arrived with the nursery transplant. They replant in the same area the following season, sometimes with the same potato neighbors, and the cycle repeats season after season. Beyond blight, the Colorado potato beetle will migrate from potato plants to tomato plants without hesitation. They are not particular about which Solanaceae member they damage. The rule: keep potatoes and tomatoes separated by at least 10 feet. Never plant them upwind or uphill from each other. Use a physical barrier, a fence line, a raised bed wall, a structure, wherever your space allows. If your garden is limited, choose one or the other for a given season and rotate annually. What we cannot see beneath the surface shapes everything that grows above it. And there you have it. 7 plants that are silently working against your tomato harvest, and exactly why. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with 3 simple rules you can apply to any tomato garden, in any space, at any skill level. Rule 1, the 3-foot minimum. Any plant that hasn't been proven to be a beneficial companion for tomatoes should be kept at least 3 feet away. This simple buffer dramatically reduces the risk of both resource competition and disease transfer. Rule 2, the rotation rule. Never plant Solanaceae family crops, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, or eggplant in the same bed 2 consecutive seasons. Rotate to a completely different crop family each year to break disease and pest cycles at the soil level. Rule 3, the debris rule. At the end of every season, remove all plant debris from disease-bridge crops completely. Do not compost tomato, potato, or pepper material into beds that will host any of these crops the following year. What you leave behind in the soil today determines what your garden inherits next spring. Now that you know what not to plant with your tomatoes, I'd love to point you toward what actually does. Our companion plants for tomatoes video walks you through the plants that actively protect, nourish, and strengthen your harvest, using the same science we explored here but with results you'll see this season. That video is linked right here. Which of these 7 plants surprised you most? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insight might just save someone else's harvest. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new garden ritual. Thanks for watching. Stay positive, and I'll see you in the next video.